Today is August 3rd, 2015. My name is Teresa Beer Larson. I am with Margaret Getz Vance. Margaret, do I have your permission to record your face and your voice today for shared stories?
Yes, you do.
Great, thank you very much. Your family has a deep connection to Ames. Not just you, but many members of your family, and I'm looking forward to talking to you about that today. But first, if you would, tell me when and where you were born.
I was born in Des Moines, Iowa in 1932.
We will get to why you were born in Des Moines, Iowa in just a little bit. But I think your family connections start a long way back. Which set of grandparents would you like to talk about first?
Well, I'd like to talk about my husband's parents first.
Great.
Because
Perfect.
they were the first to arrive in Ames.
Yes.
His father's name was Thomas, and he came here in 1914. He was a young professor and was hired by the college chaplain, back when Iowa State had a chaplain, just to help start the psychology department. Now, Thomas and his wife were expecting a baby, and they had gone to her home in Shenandoah, Iowa, for the summer until they were to be here in the fall. And the baby was born in July, and unfortunately, she passed away from complications of childbirth.
Can you imagine a young dad and his little baby? Oh my gosh, what happened next?
Well, he, of course, did come on to Iowa State. The baby was born in July, I think I said, and so he came to Iowa State in the fall. And the campus was small then, so everybody knew the young professor with the brand new baby. Sometimes he would ride his bicycle around campus with the baby in the basket. But he needed help, so his parents, who were tenant farmers, left their farm and came to Ames, and his mother helped take care of the baby, and his father got a job at Iowa State as the hog herdsman back when Iowa State had an active farm right on the campus. So they managed.
And do you have a picture?
I do.
To show us?
I do. I have a picture of Thomas and baby Jerry. Gerald, the parents always called him Gerald, but we called him Jerry. Thomas taught Psych 101, which all home ec students were required to take. And he later helped develop the child development department that many, many home ec students took. So for years, when I would travel with Frank, when we lived in different places, Frank and I, there would be people who would connect Ames, that we were from Ames, and the name Vance, and say, "Oh, I think I had your father in college." So it was very apparent to me how Iowa State influenced people all over the country.
Can you tell me a little bit about where Thomas and his new family lived in Ames?
May I tell you first about Blythe?
Sure. Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
Blythe Cessna was her name, and when she first came to Ames, she was a young teacher, and she taught at Ames High for a year. She taught math, and just an interesting note, one of her students was Clint Adams, who later became a mayor in Ames, and later than that became her next door neighbor and would intertwine with our family in other ways.
Almost everybody knows a story about some member of that Adams group in Ames.
Yes, well, and because they lived right next door, my husband and Jack Adams became lifelong good friends. And my sister married the younger Adams' son, so there were just connections there forever.
So I'm sorry, there's a little bit of digression here. So we have Thomas and Blythe kind of in Ames now. Okay.
Yes, and she just discovered that teaching math was not her thing, so she left that job after a year and became the personal secretary to Dr. Ennis, who was the first pastor of the Collegiate Presbyterian Church. And I think it was there, and then later she did some graduate work. That's how she and Thomas met one another. An interesting note about the Presbyterian Church, this was before they had a building, and so they held their services at the top floor of the Champlin building, which was on the corner of Welch and Lincoln Way, that was just demolished last spring. It was a dance hall that Iowa State students used because the Union wouldn't be built for another 19 years. And she always told me that Jerry was baptized there, surrounded by party decorations from the night before. Thomas and Blythe, this is a wedding picture of Thomas and Blythe. Interesting, different style than wedding pictures today. They were married in the home of Dr. Cessna by him, the college chaplain, and that home is now the Theta House.
Just to make sure that I understand, Blythe's connection to Dr. Cessna.
They were distant relatives.
Okay. Because I know there's a Cessna Street in Ames, which made me wonder about that.
Yes, but that's for Dr. Cessna, not for Blythe.
Okay.
Yes. And here are a couple of pictures of them as they matured. They built a home on Orchard Drive. And they took a lot of flack from their friends and co-workers, wondering why they wanted to build so far out in the country, so far away from the campus.
Can you give me a time frame for that? When were they building that house in Orchard? Just a rough time frame.
Oh my goodness, I'm not sure.
1920s sometime?
Probably in the 20s, yes.
Okay, right.
So it was the first house in that neighborhood. And it's still known by some as the Vance house, even though many people have lived in it since then. But that's where Frank was born and raised. Lived there all his life until we were married. And here are some pictures of that house. These were taken in '54, but of course the house had been there a long time by then.
For people who might want to visualize, where is Orchard Drive in Ames?
It's just south of 13th Street and off of Roosevelt. No, Ridgewood.
Ridgewood.
And
so, really, considering that they thought that was out in the country, my goodness.
Yes. Yes, it
was quite ways north, yes.
It was. And Dad Vance walked to work, and he would even walk home for lunch and take a 15-minute nap and walk back to the campus. So down the cinder path, which had been the route of the Dinky way back. Dad Vance died in 1960 at age 75, but Blythe lived to be 101 plus. So they were around Ames for a long time. And then we'll switch to my grandparents, who came to Ames in 1916, 2 years later. They had been homesteading on the college campus. Excuse me. They had been homesteading in Colorado.
Exactly, I understood.
For 8 years on the barren eastern plains of Colorado. But they had 3 sons, and then my mother was born there in a sod addition onto their house. But it got to the point where their boys had gone through all the schooling that was available in the area, so they were either going to have to send them to boarding school or they were going to have to move. And they elected to move. They came back to Ames because my grandmother had an aunt that lived here, and they stopped to visit her. And they were so impressed with Ames and the educational opportunities, they decided to settle here. Well, my grandmother, of course, had not had any decent shopping for the 8 years she'd been in Colorado, so she and her aunt went off to Des Moines to shop, and my grandfather's assignment was to find a place for them to live. Well, he had always wanted to be a farmer, so he was drawn to the country. And he found a place just north of Ames, where the Copper Cove development is today off of Riverside Road. There was a man there, he said he was sitting on the porch of the house, looking dejected, so my grandfather stopped to talk to him. And it turned out that the man had lost his wife and he was just needing to make a change. Well, by the end of the conversation, my grandfather had bought the place. House, furniture, everything. And when my grandmother got back, she was not happy.
See, while Mom was shopping, Dad was shopping.
Yes.
And
Right.
a little disparity maybe in the price point.
But they did live there for 2 years. Let me show you a picture of my grandparents.
Okay.
William and Fanny. He was called Bill. So after 2 years out there in the country, my grandmother finally got her way, and they moved into 8th Street. And lived in this little house on 8th Street. Easier to educate their children than from out in the country. Oh, I should say, while they lived out there in the country, my mother went to one-room schoolhouses. She started at Bloomington School, Bloomington was a little town north of Ames that died when the railroad chose this location instead of that.
We still have a Bloomington Road in Ames.
Yes, we do, named for that town.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And after a couple of months, they discovered that she wasn't really in that school district, so she was changed to Union School, another one-room schoolhouse that was at Highway 69 and 190th Street, where the Moose Lodge is, or the Oaks Golf Course used to be that area. And then when they moved into town, she went to North Star School, which was at 24th and Hoover. Well, my grandfather needed a job, of course, when they moved into town. And he read in the newspaper that a painter's helper had fallen off a ladder and was killed. So he quick applied for that job, and he got it. And he always said he never lacked for a job a day in his life, because he was always willing to do what needed to be done. And that's an example of that. Well, after the painting job was finished, he noticed in the paper an ad for a rural mail carrier. And even though he was right up against the top age limit, he did apply. And there was a civil service exam required for that. And I think he said there were about 24 people applying, all young men. And my grandfather only had a 4th grade education as far as a formal education. Otherwise, he was self-educated. So he was pretty discouraged when all the young men turned in their papers and he was still working away. But as it turned out, he got the highest score and the job. And he loved that job. He worked at that job for the next 17 years until he was 65, retirement age.
Imagine him. I could just see him. This man whose psyche is in the country, and he gets to ride around in the country delivering mail to people. It must have been just a perfect fit for him.
Well, I think it was, and he didn't just leave the mail in the mailbox. He would stop and talk with his patrons, with the farmers, and he was collecting information from them all this time. And he was truly interested in what they were doing and how they were doing it, which would serve him well later on. He did retire at age 65, but when he got that job, they bought a house at 1720 Grand Avenue, which again was right on the edge of town. I have a picture of what Grand Avenue looked like at that time. It wasn't the Grand Avenue we think of today, and that the house they bought is in this picture.
And we are looking north.
This is looking north from about 13th Street.
My goodness.
Yes.
It was out in the country.
It was. But there was a little barn there, so he could have a horse. because sometimes he needed a horse. The cars wouldn't get through on the muddy road, or his motorcycle. So he delivered mail those 3 ways: car, motorcycle, and by horse. The area they bought was about 5 acres, and today there are 4 houses along Grand Avenue on the front edge of that, where there was just the one when they moved there, when they bought it.
May I ask what happened to the original house?
The original house is still there.
It is still there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so it's about, you said it's 17th and Grand.
17th and Grand.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry if I missed that.
17th didn't go. There wasn't a 17th at the time, but there is now. There were 3 acres in the back of that house that he had planted to black walnut trees by the Civilian Conservation Corps when they were housed in Ames and doing that sort of thing.
So this would be in the 30s?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Okay.
And today that area has become Durrell Circle, which is just a little road with a cul-de-sac off of Wilson Avenue.
So
And
you have a family name, you have a street name in your
For
town?
my grandparents.
For your grandparents.
Yes, we do. If you can find the street, it's kind of hidden and very short. But I expect there are still black walnut trees there that were planted at that time.
And your grandparents' first and last names were?
Durrell.
No, first and last names.
William.
William.
But he went
You
by
call him Bill.
And Fanny.
And Fanny. Okay.
They when their children all left home, they built a small house next to the 1720 Grand house. I thought these were in order. And they moved into it, and it looked like this. This was taken in 1938. I can't tell you exactly when it was built, but it's also still standing today. It has this sloping thing here. Was the garage door, which was counterbalanced. You had to get out of your car and raise this up, and you drove under the house, and that's where the car was garaged, if you can imagine. And the big house had the same kind of garage when we first moved into it.
Is that a typical construction piece?
Well, though, I'm feeling that it was because those 2 houses both had that. I don't really know how.
It has a root cellar feel to me, is what I'm thinking.
Yes. But today, of course, all of that is gone, and they've built a safer kind of garage.
Safer kind of garage.
Bill was in the Spanish-American War. He was one of the last Spanish-American War veterans to live in Ames, the only one that served in the Iowa unit. He used to be in the Memorial Day parades. He wrote poetry, which he never claimed to be poetry. He always said he wrote jingles, but some of it was really very, very elegant poetry. When he retired from the rural mail business, he still was interested in farming. And he finally did go to a realtor and say he wanted the worst farm in Story County, because that's all he could afford. And also he wanted to see if he could take a worn-out farm and bring it back into production, using all these ideas he had collected through the years delivering mail. So that's what he did, and that farm will play in our story again as time goes on. He died in 1967 at the age of 92 from what we now realize was Alzheimer's disease. They didn't call it that then, and there wasn't good care for it then, but we're quite sure that's what it was. Fanny was active in the Women's Relief Corps. Now that was the first patriotic organization for women in Ames, and had 100 members at one time. And it was organized to serve the Grand Army of the Republic, which was the Civil War army that fought for the North. And they had erected a monument in the Ames Cemetery, in the old part of the cemetery, of course. That was before my grandmother was involved. But over the years, it was decided that that monument needed to be moved to a better spot. So at the time it was moved, my grandmother was president of the organization, and so she spoke at the dedication of the monument. Now what they did, this doesn't show the monument, but this was the dedication of the monument. They used this, it's a large upright stone, and they turned the stone around and re-engraved it to include a memorial, make it a memorial for veterans of all wars. It's still standing at the cemetery. Just if you go in the 9th Street entrance, it's to the right there where people gather at Memorial Day. And if you crawl around behind, you can still see the old inscription.
And if I go there, I'll think about your grandmother who helped dedicate it.
Oh, okay, that would be nice. She was also very active in the Women's Auxiliary of the Rural Mail Carriers. Now, the country was very rural back in those days, so this was a very large, active organization. She was state president, and I just recently have learned through some research that she had become the treasurer of the national organization, and had traveled to several conventions around the country, and this just doesn't seem to fit with the grandmother I knew, but it was true. And she was also active in the Women's Christian Temperance Union. That was the group that fought for Prohibition. And all of her life, she voted for the Prohibition candidate for president of the United States. And I did a little research and found out that the Prohibition Party had a candidate until 2012. When they only got 519 votes, and then they finally gave up.
If Fanny had been living, one of them might have been her votes.
Yes, it would have been. I'm sure it would have been. She died in 1972 at the age of 94. Mm-hmm. So I've got some pretty good genes.
Long-living
longevity
genes. Yes.
Genes. Now I'd like to talk about my parents.
Yes.
My mom, Loya Durrell, was her name. Loya was a name my grandmother read in a book somewhere and liked. We've never found anybody else that wasn't a relative with that name. And as I said, she was born on the homestead in Colorado, in a sod addition to the house, and attended the one-room schools after she moved to Ames. When she was ready for 9th grade, she went to Old Central School. And now that building stood where our City Hall stands today. And during her time there, a new school was built across Clark Street where the parking lot is today, which was the second Ames High School. There have been 3 different buildings called Central, so it's very confusing. She was a classmate of Farwell Brown, Ames historian. They were in the class of 29, and that was a very active class. They are the ones that came up with the motto for Ames High that's still used today, Ames High, Ames High. And the shield that was part of their logo. She also helped to organize the Pep Club, which was a very active organization for many, many, many years at Ames High.
How would something like that come about? A girl helping to organize, my goodness.
Well, a group of girls had gone to a football game in Newton, and they were so impressed by their pep club and how it really seemed to help the team and the spirit and all of that, that on the trip back home, they decided they would organize one for Ames High. So they, I don't know how, well, I think the faculty chose the members originally. And there were something like 36 girls. And they bought sweatshirts, and they cut out felt letters that said PEP, P-E-P, across their chests. The picture I have is black and white, and so, but I'm sure it was orange and black. And that was the start of a very active organization at Ames High for many years. While my mom was in high school, my dad Austin Getz was his name, came to Ames from Edgeley, North Dakota to attend Iowa State. And he roomed with the family that lived right across that muddy Grand Avenue. Dr. Bush was his name. And my dad lived there, and they managed to get back and forth across that muddy road and met one another and fell in love. And my dad graduated from Iowa State in 1930, and Mom and Dad were married in 1931 in that 1720 grand house on where her parents lived.
Mm-hmm. It probably wasn't quite as muddy by then.
No, I think it might have been a little better by then.
Yeah.
It was a Depression time, and weddings were modest. And my dad, he was a veterinarian, and he chose a military career. It was, as I said, it was during the Depression, and jobs were scarce, so the military was a good opportunity.
And the military still had cavalry.
Yes, they did.
They still had animals that needed attention and care.
Veterinarians. Yes. Yes. So that was an opportunity for a veterinarian. Mm-hmm. They were first stationed at Fort Des Moines, and that's where I was born. The officers' quarters were located where the Blank Park Zoo is today. So I can claim I was born in the zoo.
Were you actually born on the military base?
No, not
really.
I was born at Lutheran Hospital.
Okay.
But that was.
But you returned to the space that's now the zoo.
That's now the zoo. Yeah. So I probably should word that a little differently. But anyway, and as military families are, we were moved from place to place. We lived in Langleyfield, Virginia, and then the Philippine Islands for a couple of years, and then back to 2 different places in Texas. And while we were in Texas, World War II broke out, and my dad was sent overseas to New Guinea to serve there. So my mom elected to bring the 3 of us, there were 3 of us children by then, back to Ames because her parents lived here. So that was the first of the 4 times I've lived in Ames. Interestingly, having lived in Texas for a number of years, the car they had didn't have a heater. It was not standard on a car if you lived in Texas. So she had to have a heater installed in the car before she drove back to Iowa because it was December. At that point, Mom found us a nice little house on Ridgewood, 804 Ridgewood. And that was a very fortunate find because it was a great neighborhood. I count that year as the best year of my growing up years. There were lots of kids in the neighborhood. It was a time when it was safe to play outdoors till the street lights came on at night, and we just had a wonderful, wonderful year. I went to Roosevelt School.
Can you talk a little bit about Roosevelt School? Of course, recently it's been changed from a learning center and an attendance center for school children to living condominiums.
Yes.
So, can you, as a young girl, I know you attended a lot of schools, so I'm going to have to find something that might impress you about that.
Ames High was my 13th school, so I've been acquainted with a lot of different schools. And then my granddaughter attended Roosevelt too, so I had visited it, which kind of skews your memories of it when it was old. I did go back to tour when they had the open house for the condominiums, and it didn't feel like the old school until I got to the stairway. And they've saved the old stairway, and then you just all of a sudden felt like you were back at Roosevelt School. Yeah. It was a very patriotic time, of course, during World War II, and the country was very solidly behind that effort. So I remember that we had paper drives, we had scrap metal drives, and my sister and I had a fat route, we called it. The government wanted housewives to save their meat drippings, bacon grease, the melted down fat from the meat that you didn't want to eat. And they apparently repurposed that in making ammunition. And you were to return it to the grocery store, and they would give you a little bit of money back. And it was kind of a nuisance to housewives to do all of this, had to be prepared in a certain way. So my sister and I contacted neighbors, and they were willing to give us their meat drippings and fat, and we would take it home and melt it down and prepare it the way it was needed to be received at the grocery store and get the money. We got to keep the money.
Now you were maybe 9 years old or so?
I was in 6th grade.
Oh, you were in 6th grade. Okay. Yeah. And so
we were a little...
You were a little bit older.
A little bit older.
But this was an age where you were accepting the responsibility. You're going door to door with your wagon.
Yeah, with our wagon. That's exactly what we did. And then they decided, instead of giving the little bit of money back, they would give ration coupons. Well, the housewives all wanted the ration coupons, so that was the end of our fat route. When Dad got back, we were then transferred again to Battle Creek, Michigan, and a suburb of Milwaukee, before he was retired from the military. The war ended when we were living in Milwaukee. So we came back to Ames then in 1946, my second time in Ames. And we lived in that Grand Avenue house. My grandparents had kept that house when they moved next door and had rented it out, to our good fortune. So then that became our home. So to me, that was my home in Ames.
That's all. We're talking now 3 generations that have been in that house. Your grandparents, your mom, and you.
That's right. Yeah. And I was in 9th grade at the time and attended Central Junior High, which was the high school that my mother graduated from, had become a junior high by then. During that period of time, my mom was active in PEO and the Story County Crippled Children's Society, where she helped with Camp Sunnyside. She was very active in the Congregational Church, but her great love was the League of Women Voters. She became the state president, and as such, she got to go to Washington, D.C., and they had a meeting in the Rose Garden with President Kennedy, and she got to shake his hand. Now, this was a time when women always wore hats and gloves, and I have here the pair of gloves that she was wearing when she shook hands with President Kennedy. She never washed them. So we like to think...
Shall I hold it up? That's fine. You're fine.
We like to think we might have some of President Kennedy's DNA on this right-hand glove. Mom was also always interested in conservation. She was a great outdoors person and was active in many of that kind of organization. In the 60s, Congressman Neil Smith proposed building a dam on the Skunk River that would create a lake out in the area. I guess I should have said first that, well, I think I skipped over. Well, my parents had built a home out in the country on this farm that my grandfather had bought and had brought back up. He had taken it from producing 10 bushels of corn to the acre. This was my grandfather.
Right.
He never farmed it. He always had tenant farmers, but they were instructed to do only what he told them to do, and he was able to bring that farm from producing the 10 bushels to the acre up to 100 bushels per acre before he died, and of course it produces more than that now. But my parents then eventually built a house out there, and this is what the house looked like when they built it.
So it went from Bill Durrell's land being a farm to Mr. and Mrs. Getz, and then they
Yes.
have a house here. Okay.
Yes,
All right.
and they, again, didn't farm it, they
Right.
rented out the land.
Exactly.
But the house was an acreage, and I'll just, at this point, go on to say that eventually my husband and I lived there, and we altered the house. Everybody that's lived there has changed it a bit. So it looked like this, and then again we changed the siding, so it looked like this. It looks more like this today. And my son and his wife lived there, and my son still.
Wow. 4 generations.
Well, and then if you count my son's children, that's 5 generations. Anyway, back to this proposed dam. It would have been in this area. This house was right along on the bluff overlooking the Skunk River. So it was an area my parents were really familiar with and concerned about. And there were a lot of things wrong with this proposal, and even a lot of people at Iowa State said, the land isn't right. It's going to silt up very quickly. It's not going to do what they think it's going to do. It was Congressman Smith's way of bringing some federal money into the state. And anyway, my mom fought hard against this dam. During this it was a 10-year battle. She got up a petition signed by 2,000 people, which the petition now is in the archives at the Historical Society. The route of the interstate was just being built when all of this was going on, and the route of the interstate was actually changed. So if you are wondering why there's this curve in the interstate as you go between Ames and Story City, it was to go around this proposed lake that never happened. And there even is a little area, it's now called a prairie area. It was first called Scenic View, and there was no view there, so eventually they changed the sign. But that's why those two things exist today.
So your mom was identified with this effort. And I'm guessing that there were some people who liked and didn't like her effort.
Well, that's very true. And so she became known as the Dam Lady, or that Dam Lady, depending on which side of the issue you happen to be on. That proposal was finally dropped in 1974. 10 years later, it was deactivated and by the government. But it raised its head again 10 years later, kind of a trial balloon, but that didn't go anywhere. And actually, my grandfather had fought it back in the 40s. So just because the land is right for building a dam in a certain area, somebody previously had thought we should build a dam there.
Now, would that dam not only, your mother was interested in the appropriateness of it, but would it have flooded all your land?
During high water times, it would have put the house on an island. But it would, and then it would have been mud flats around the house
Yes.
in low water times. And it would have cut off any access. So, of course, we wouldn't have been able to stay there. But that was, of course, that was part of her reason for fighting it, a vested interest, but she also felt it was inappropriate. It would have taken out all the trees along the Skunk River in that area between Ames and between Soper's Mill
Right.
and Story City. So there were a lot of other negatives. And in the meantime, there's been an effort by the Conservation Commission to develop a greenbelt trail along there, and they've been adding land along the river. So it's still public use land along there, but it's a different kind of use. And now we have Ada Hayden Lake, which serves the purpose that that lake was supposed to in a much less intrusive way. My dad, he was a wonderful gardener and was known for his gardens. There were times when he would specialize in growing lilies and then he later grew orchids in the little greenhouse he had, and he, for a while, sold perennial plants. He was known as quite a gardener. He became Ames' first city sanitarian. As the military decreased their use of horses, they retrained their veterinarians to do food inspection.
Still into science. That makes sense.
So that was what he had been doing, and that sort of qualified him for the city sanitarian job. That was the person who inspected the restaurants and the dairies to be sure everything was sanitary and being done correctly.
Can you remember at all roughly the time period? Was this after you came from Milwaukee? Is that when you came back to Ames as a 9th grader? Was he already the sanitarian then at that time?
He was not well when he first got out of the military, so there was a year when he just needed to recover. And then he became city sanitarian in 1947 and served for 10 years. And part of that job was teaching a dairy inspection class at Iowa State. At the time he took over that job, Ames had an open dump, and rats were a problem. And yes, and he took Ames from that kind of disposal to a landfill, which was the cutting edge thing at the time. And that helped the rat population a lot. So he kind of jokingly claimed to be Ames' Pied Piper because he got rid of the rats. Both he and my mom were also very active in the Congregational Church. And at the time that the church added the large addition to the back of it's to the east of the building where their fellowship hall is today, he was the layperson in charge of that project. And one day he was checking on how things were going as they were getting close to finishing it, and he was talking with the mason who was bricking up the outer part, and the mason said, well, you know, there's nothing on the back of this building that faces this parking lot that will let people know this is a church. How about putting a cross here? And my dad thought that was a great idea, but he said there's no money in the budget for that. We've already spent all of our money. So they made a deal that the mason would brick in a white cross on the back of that building and not charge them. And if my dad would give the okay. And he okayed it on the spot without consulting anybody, the committee or anyone else. And he said it was 6 months before anybody questioned him on how he was able to afford to do that.
And that's still there today. I went past there to the public library, and now I know why that's there.
Yes, and of course now they have added the words that, and the church has changed names too. It's the United Church of Christ now instead of Congregational Church. But for many, many decades it was just the white cross was the only thing. My dad was also a woodworker. And one of the things that he did was he made small items, plates and trays and wheat pots and easels and toast tongs that he donated to the church to sell at their bazaar. And it was the big draw at their bazaar for many years. Here he is in his shop with some of his items. And this is a picture of them on display at the 1980 bazaar. And another picture of some of his items. And they were a popular draw for that bazaar for many years. And even now, he's been gone for 26 years, and even now I will occasionally go into someone's home and see one of the pieces that he made.
Do some of them come back to you sometimes?
As people are downsizing, sometimes they will bring me pieces and say, would you like to have this? And of course I can't turn them down, but I'll pass them along to my grandchildren. We were always swimmers. Army posts always have swimming pools and special times for officers and their families to swim. So we just and my mom was such an outdoors person that we kind of grew up in swimming pools. And when we came to Ames, of course, Carr's Pool was our place. And our favorite time to go would be after church on Sunday, because the pools would be practically empty and we would have them to ourselves. My sister Nancy and I both taught Red Cross swimming. She tended toward teaching the tiny tots, and I moved more toward teaching life-saving and water safety instructor.
Carr's Pool was central to so many children in their growing up time periods in Ames. Do you have other stories? Do you remember funny times or even climactic times or any other human interest about working or playing at Carr's Pool?
I can remember how cold it was in the mornings when we had to teach all those little kids swimming, all these little kids turning blue and shivering, and we were too. It was just a great fun place to be.
And some of the equipment.
The spinning tops, of course, were a favorite and kind of a unique thing, and really rather dangerous. But I can't remember anybody really getting hurt on them.
Right. So you were there if you were teaching swimming, you were there maybe constantly for like 4 to 6 weeks during the summer.
Mm-hmm. In the mornings, and then the afternoons it was open for public swimming. So it would be the mornings, and some mornings can be pretty chilly because we started early. And then I followed, when I went to Iowa State, I was a member of NIADS, which was the synchronized swimming club at Iowa State. And our director was Barbara Forker, and
for whom the Forker
women's
building
gym is now named the Forker Building in her honor.
It's such a good sport, Margaret. That's
well, it's a good workout.
Yes, it is.
And synchronized swimming
is particular. I was thinking synchronized swimming.
It's a lot harder than it looks, I can tell you.
Do you still swim?
Oh, I do a little. When I go to the lake in the summer, I try to swim every day, but yeah, nothing like I used to. Kind of paddling around at this point. I did attend Ames High School, that is in the building that is now our city hall, and that's where I met Frank, my husband, and we both went on to Iowa State. Let's see. Here I am. This is my high school graduation picture from Ames High School. And this is Frank's high school graduation picture. He was a year ahead of me. I graduated in 1950 and he in 49. We were married in 1953 in the Congregational Church here in Ames. It was during the time of the Korean conflict, and Frank had been in ROTC, so he had that 2-year military obligation. But the conflict was winding down, and so he was fortunate to serve his 2 years in Wichita, Kansas, instead of Korea. And so we lived there for 2 years and added our daughter to our family then. We came back to Ames. This would be my third time to live in Ames, for Frank to do graduate work after he finished his military career. And we had the privilege of living in Pamell Court, and this is our place in Pamell Court. We felt very lucky because we got a tree, and to have a little bit of shade in Pamell Court was a real plus. There were the three of us living in a one-bedroom place, and before we moved away, we had added one more child, so there were 4 of us in that little place for a short time.
Did you have friends and neighbors who were in the same kind of situation?
Oh yes, everybody out there. You know, we were all temporary, and everybody was going to school, so we were all kind of dirt poor. So it was fun because you knew you didn't have to live that way the rest of your life. It was kind of an adventure.
There were 2 segments of Pamell Court. There was one kind of on the east side of the road, and there was one on the west side of the road.
We were on the east side,
okay.
And that was the barracks ones. The Quonset huts tended to be on the other side.
Right.
And the barracks were much better than the Quonset huts. old and decrepit as they were much better.
I do remember the
and-
Quonset huts came down before the Pamell Court.
barracks.
The barracks.
Yes.
But those barracks stayed there a long time.
Oh, they did. It was supposed to be temporary, and I think they served for 50 years before they came down. But it was very inexpensive. I think $35 a month was what we paid, and that was, I think, after Frank got his master's degree, he stayed on and worked in the counseling service, and the rent went up when he was no longer a student. But I think it went up to the $65 a month, so
Pretty affordable.
pretty affordable. Yeah. Frank, after we left Iowa State, Frank carried on his career, and that determined where we went and where we lived. He was in special education, and he became the chief of the State Bureau of Special Education, a position that he held longer than any other state chief in the country. And it was under his time there that the area education agencies were formed. In fact, he wrote the bill creating them at our kitchen table. So that was one of the major things but he was very well respected in his education. We've already talked about the house on the farm that my mom built. When the place got to be too much for my parents to take care of, I should say that house was built on the side of a hill with a walkout apartment on the lower level. And when my folks couldn't take care of the place anymore, we decided we would move to the farm, live in the main part of the house, and my parents would live in the apartment, which we did. We moved, so this was after following my husband's career around to many different places. So this was my fourth time to return to Ames, and the final one. And that happened on the 4th of July weekend in 1976. It was very strange to come back to Ames after many years of living in other places. We went downtown just to walk around and kind of get reacquainted, and it had a strange feel of being familiar and yet not familiar, because the buildings were the same, but the businesses were different, for a good many of them were, and we didn't see people we knew, and that was unusual.
Ames had grown quite a bit. So
it had grown, and it's a mobile community, so a lot of people had come and gone. But as we were walking down the street, we ran into a couple from high school friends, and then it seemed like home again. Frank commuted for 18 years back to his job in Des Moines. His office was in the Capitol complex, and for 18 years he drove back and forth. And only 5 times in the 18 years did he miss getting to work, which is pretty amazing when you think of the Iowa winters we have.
They're pretty challenging.
And we were 5 miles of gravel before you could get to the interstate. I worked after the children. Well, the children were grown and gone by that time that we moved back to Ames. But I worked at the shops on Grand for a while. I started the day that they opened in 1993. And then I was with the Sugar Tree, which was one of the shops, and as time went on, they moved to Main Street, and I moved with them. And then later I worked at Mary Kay's Flowers for a number of years. I neglected to show you pictures of my parents. Can I show you those
yes,
now?
Please do.
Okay. This is my mom's high school graduation, 1992. And
high school graduation.
Ames High School.
Ames High School
graduation.
Okay.
And this is my dad at the same time. Of course, he didn't graduate in Ames, but this is when he moved to Ames. And
And when did your mother graduate from high school?
92,
Nine.
29.
29. Oh, that's why I
Excuse
went.
me. I got
wanted
that
to make
backwards.
sure.
Yeah. 29. And this is my parents, the way people will remember them in Ames, I think. My dad died of cancer in 89 at the age of 83, and my mom moved here to Northcrest a few years after that, and she lived here quite a while, and she lived to be 95. Well, in 1999, we were in the same place that my folks were. The place got to be too much for us to take care of, and so that's when my son Scott and his family, his wife and 2 children, moved out to Granddad's farm. We named it Granddad's farm because that's what it was to everybody in the family. And we moved into the apartment on the lower level. Frank developed Lewy body dementia, which is a combination kind of Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. And so we moved here to Northcrest in 2009, and I lost him the next year, 2010, after 8 years of caregiving. And I was very fortunate at that time. There was an opening at the Ames Historical Society, and I applied for the job, and even though there were many younger people, I was hired, I think, because of all these roots I had in Ames. They said they couldn't teach me that history, but they could teach me the technology that they really wanted. Oh, they didn't know how hard that was going to be. What a challenge.
But I am reminded, I think your granddad applied for a job when there were more younger people, and he got it. So maybe there's a pattern there.
There's a family pattern, I guess. But that's been a real blessing in my life to have that. I've been there 5 years now, and it has really filled that gap, and it came just when my husband died, so it worked out very well. And just I'll just say, as far as Granddad's farm goes, now my son is the place where it's too much for him to take care of. He lost his wife to cancer 6 years ago, and his children are now grown and gone, and so Granddad's farm is going to go out of the family, but it's been a great experience, and it's what needs to happen for the future.
Mm-hmm. I always give people, as we conclude a conversation, an opportunity to share anything about living and working in Ames, maybe that I've forgotten to ask you, or there's something that has just occurred to you and it was not on your thoughts that you prepared for today. So that is my final opportunity for you to reflect on anything about growing up or working in Ames that shared stories might be interested in.
Well, just a general comment about what a wonderful place Ames is to live. Even though I did all this traveling and experienced a lot of different places, it was always Ames that drew us back, and I just never thought of wanting to settle anyplace else.
Well, thank you so much for sharing time with me today, Margaret. Your family has deep and influential and fun and interesting roots in Ames, as you do as well. So, and I think we should probably, I should be forthcoming in saying that I work with you at the Ames Historical Society, and I'll enjoy doing that so much more now that I know a little bit more about you. So
Thank you so much.
thank you, Margaret.